Clara often told herself that she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her household, a rhythm shaped more by silence than conversation. Mark worked long hours, often leaving before dawn and returning after midnight, carrying with him the fatigue of endless meetings and travel. She respected his dedication and the life he provided, but she could not deny how the walls of their home sometimes echoed with a kind of emptiness that felt heavier than quiet. She filled her days with chores, books, and fleeting calls to friends, but the evenings were the hardest. It was in those hours, when the house was dim and still, that she felt the loneliness settle deepest in her bones. When Ethan returned from college for the summer, the atmosphere of the house shifted in ways Clara did not expect. She remembered him as a restless teenager, moody and sarcastic, often retreating to his room. But the young man who stepped through the door was different. Taller, broader-shouldered, with a calm presence that seemed to demand attention without effort. He carried himself with a confidence that startled her. He spoke to her kindly, asking how she had been, helping carry groceries inside, lingering in the kitchen as she prepared meals. It was not extraordinary behavior, yet for Clara it felt unusual simply because she was not used to being noticed so attentively within her own home. At first she brushed away the awareness. He was Mark's son, a boy she had helped guide through awkward teenage years, someone she had scolded about homework and reminded to take out the trash. But time had altered him, and she found herself sometimes forgetting that he was the same Ethan who once sulked at the dinner table. There was a warmth in his smile that she had never quite registered before, and it unsettled her. Their conversations began innocently, stretched across afternoons when Mark was away. Ethan would ask her opinion about his classes, about the future he wanted but had not yet defined. She would pour him tea, listening intently, surprised at how much he confided. "It feels like you actually hear me," he once said, his gaze steady, his voice carrying a weight that made her breath catch for a second too long. Clara laughed it off, telling herself it was just youthful gratitude, but the words lingered in her chest like an ember refusing to fade. There were moments she caught herself studying him more closely than she should, when he reached for a plate in the cupboard, when he leaned over the counter to slice fruit, when he laughed with a tone so rich it vibrated through the kitchen. She chastised herself immediately, scolding her thoughts as though they were misbehaving children. It was wrong, she reminded herself. She was his stepmother, and she was married. Loyalty should have been simple. Yet temptation rarely presented itself as something monstrous. It came disguised as something familiar, something safe, until it grew too close to ignore. She began to notice the contrast more sharply. Mark would call home quickly, distracted, asking if she needed anything, before cutting the conversation short to return to his obligations. Ethan, meanwhile, stayed present. He asked about her day, noticed when she seemed tired, even suggested they cook dinner together. There was a gentleness in his attention that filled a gap she had not wanted to admit existed. Each small gesture seemed insignificant on its own, but when stacked together, they formed a bridge she was afraid of crossing. One evening, as the two of them sat at the dining table with half-empty plates between them, Ethan said something that left her unsettled long after he went to bed. "Sometimes I feel like you're the only person who actually knows me," he admitted, his voice low, almost confessional. Clara smiled softly, trying to frame it as maternal understanding, but inside her chest a flutter betrayed her. She carried the words upstairs like a secret, lying awake with them circling her mind, chasing away sleep. It was in that quiet, staring at the ceiling, that Clara felt a dangerous curiosity bloom. She thought of the years spent waiting for Mark to come home, of the countless nights spent alone at the table with a cold cup of tea. She thought of the warmth in Ethan's eyes, the sincerity in his words, the unguarded honesty that Mark no longer gave her. She did not yet name what she was feeling, but she knew it was something she should not encourage. And yet, she also knew that a part of her, however small, wanted to. The house had not changed. The same walls stood, the same routines played out. But Clara felt as though something within its air had shifted, charged with an unspoken possibility. It was both thrilling and frightening, and she found herself caught between denial and acknowledgement. As she finally closed her eyes, exhaustion winning over restless thought. She could not silence the echo of Ethan's words, a confession that had slipped past her defenses and into the hidden corners of her heart. The days slipped by, and with them, Clara's awareness of Ethan grew sharper. She noticed the way he lingered in the kitchen even after finishing his meals, how he asked about her favorite books, how his laughter seemed to fill the spaces that Mark's absence left behind. It was nothing she could point to as inappropriate, and yet every moment with him carried an undercurrent that she both resisted and secretly sought. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the living room, Clara felt Ethan drop onto the couch beside her with an ease that startled her. He picked up a shirt, awkwardly attempting to fold it. His clumsy attempt made her laugh, and for a moment the sound filled the room with something lighter than she had felt in weeks. "I guess I was never meant for domestic life," he joked, shaking his head. Clara corrected his folding, her hands brushing against his briefly. It was an innocent contact, but the silence that followed stretched longer than it should have. She could feel his eyes on her, and when she looked up, there was something unspoken in his expression. She pulled her hand back quickly, her chest tightening, and forced the moment to end with a smile that felt rehearsed. As the weeks continued, their conversations deepened. Ethan began to share stories from school, not just the surface-level anecdotes but the things he rarely admitted to anyone else. He spoke about the pressure to live up to expectations, the loneliness he felt even surrounded by friends, the sense that people saw only what they wanted from him. Clara listened, nodding, offering comfort. She found herself telling him things she had never told Mark. Small vulnerabilities, frustrations, dreams she once held but had long abandoned. The exchange grew into a ritual, a private world they slipped into whenever they were alone. The secrecy of it thrilled and frightened her. She would catch herself wondering what Mark would say if he walked in to hear them laughing in the kitchen, or if he saw how closely Ethan leaned in when speaking to her. Yet she could not bring herself to stop. Instead, she found excuses to prolong their time together, to keep him near. If he offered to help with errands, she accepted. If he asked her to watch a movie with him, she agreed. Each decision felt harmless, yet the sum of them weighed heavily on her conscience. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last traces of daylight fade, Ethan spoke in a voice that carried a kind of raw honesty that left Clara's heart racing. "Sometimes I think people only see me as Mark's son. They don't really see who I am. But you do." He turned his head, and his eyes locked with hers in the dim light. Clara swallowed hard, her mind searching for a response that would keep the boundary intact, but the truth was she had no answer. The silence lingered, and she finally looked away, gripping the arm of her chair as though it could anchor her. That night, Clara lay awake again, her mind replaying his words. She knew she was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. It was not physical, not yet, but the emotional intimacy had already taken root. She had shared with Ethan pieces of herself that Mark no longer asked about, and that realization shook her. Had she already betrayed her husband, even without a touch or a kiss? The question kept her staring at the ceiling long after the house had gone still. The next day, guilt made her avoid Ethan. She busied herself with chores, answered him briefly, tried to put distance between them. But by evening, she found herself sitting across from him at the dinner table, drawn back into the orbit she claimed she wanted to escape. His laughter broke down her resolve. His quiet attention made her feel alive, and the cycle began again. Late one night, Ethan knocked softly on her door. Clara froze, her pulse racing. She opened it just a crack, whispering his name like a warning. His eyes looked troubled, vulnerable. I needed someone to talk to," he said, voice barely above a whisper. She let him in, sitting on the edge of her bed as he spoke about his fears of failing, of disappointing everyone, of never finding his place in the world. Clara listened, her heart aching for him. When he finally looked up, his eyes glistened with sincerity, and she realized the line between comfort and intimacy had blurred beyond recognition. When he left her room that night, nothing had happened beyond words. But as Clara closed the door behind him, she leaned against it, her heart pounding, her breath uneven. She knew she had crossed into dangerous territory. The question was no longer whether something might happen but when. Clara told herself over and over that she would pull back, that the closeness with Ethan had gone too far, that she had to re-establish the boundaries that were slipping away like sand through her fingers. But telling herself and doing it were two different things, and each day she found another reason to linger in his company. What had started as simple companionship had grown into something heavier, something she no longer trusted herself to manage. The house seemed smaller now, charged with unspoken tension that followed her from room to room. One evening, after a long phone call with Mark that ended in frustration, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. He had barely listened, distracted by deadlines, ending the call with a quick, "We'll talk later." The hollowness of his words echoed in her chest. She felt foolish for expecting more, foolish for holding on to a marriage that seemed increasingly distant. She didn't hear Ethan at first when he stepped into the room, his voice soft with concern. "Are you okay?" She looked up and found him standing there, his expression tender, his presence grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. For a moment she wanted to lie, to wave it off as nothing, but the weight of her loneliness slipped past her guard. "I'm just tired of feeling invisible," she admitted. Her voice cracked, betraying the emotions she had worked so hard to contain. Ethan crossed the room without hesitation and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The warmth of his touch startled her, but she did not pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, breathing in the comfort it offered. It was innocent in form, yet the current running beneath it was undeniable. When she opened her eyes, his gaze held hers, steady and searching, as though he were waiting for permission she knew she should never give. The silence stretched, the air thick with possibility. Clara's heart raced, torn between the life she had built and the longing that pressed against her resolve. She told herself to move, to create space, to remind him of the line that could not be crossed. But when she finally spoke, the words came out softer than she intended. "This isn't right." "I know," Ethan whispered, his voice low and strained. Yet neither of them moved. It was as though the acknowledgement itself had released something that had been building for weeks. And in that fragile moment, the boundary broke. What happened next was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost tentative, filled with hesitation and an ache that felt both wrong and inevitable. Clara hated herself for the relief she felt in his closeness, for the way his attention made her feel alive again. For a fleeting moment, she let herself believe it was not betrayal but connection, something pure twisted by circumstance. But the guilt was immediate, sharp, and unrelenting. In the days that followed, the house felt different. Clara moved through it like a shadow, guilt pressing against her chest. Ethan, too, seemed changed, more protective, more possessive in small ways that unsettled her. He lingered longer in rooms, watched her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and yet neither of them spoke about what had happened. The silence between them was heavier than words. Mark remained oblivious, calling briefly to check in, making vague promises about time together once his workload lightened. Clara found herself unable to listen without flinching, the sound of his voice colliding with the memory of what she had done. She wanted to confess, to release the weight of the secret, but the fear of destroying everything held her back. The tension grew until it spilled into a near discovery. One afternoon, as Clara and Ethan spoke quietly in the living room, Mark called unexpectedly on video. Clara scrambled to compose herself, her voice trembling as she answered. Ethan slipped out of view, his footsteps hurried, the silence between them afterward deafening. Clara's heart pounded, realization striking her with brutal clarity. This was not sustainable. Secrets had a way of surfacing, and when they did, the fallout would be devastating. That night, Clara sat alone in her bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Eyes shadowed by guilt, lips pressed into a tight line, shoulders heavy with choices she could not undo. She thought of Ethan, of the way his presence had lit something inside her she thought was long dead. She thought of Mark, of the years they had shared, of the vows she had once spoken with sincerity. And she wondered how love and betrayal could exist so closely side by side. When sleep finally claimed her, it was restless, filled with dreams of doors opening and secrets spilling into the light. She knew the future held consequences she could not yet name. Whether she confessed, buried the truth, or let it unravel on its own, the damage had already been done. In the quiet of that night, Clara whispered to herself a question that would not leave her. Was it love she had stumbled into, or was it simply the reflection of her own loneliness mirrored in Ethan's eyes? The house remained silent, as though holding its breath, waiting for the truth to break free.